My Govanen. Welcome to the Tolkien Lore channel. I'm the Tolkien Geek, and this is the 5th video in my Silmarillion Synopsis series covering Chapter 3 of the Quinta Silmarillion, of the coming of the Elves and the captivity of Melkor. We've already gotten the creation of dwarves and ents in the previous video, and as usual I'll link to the playlist so you can check out all the videos in this series. But now we finally get the elves, and this is where things really start to pick up. We're going to move into a lot more action, a lot less preparatory background story. So let's find out about the elves. We start off with a brief recap of kind of where we left off after the main battle with Melkor, the destruction of the lamps. It tells us that growth had halted because there was now no light except in Valinor, where the Valar had the two trees. And basically there's not a whole lot going on there. Melkor is ruling unopposed in the north, spreading ever southward. He's got his monsters and things. It says he's gathering to himself his demons, which it tells us are called the Balrogs, creatures that have hearts of fire but are cloaked in shadow, and they carry whips of flame, and you get the idea, that these are going to be important later. Of course they will. So there's not a whole lot going on besides Melkor kind of spreading his dominion, and it tells us that really the only two of the Valar who go to Middle-earth are Yavanna and Orome. Yavanna kind of put everything into a sleep while there's no light or anything going on in Middle-earth. Orome still rides in Middle-earth, kind of scaring away the monsters of Melkor. We kind of already got a little bit of this, but it's giving us a bit of a recap. So as a result of all this, though, Yavanna finally goes to the rest of the Valar and basically says, are we just going to leave Melkor unopposed forever? The elves are coming at some point, and we need to make sure that they're not going to be destroyed or corrupted, and Melkor is also kind of just ruining Middle-earth, and nothing that I've created can grow because there's no light. Everything's just kind of, there's nothing good going on. And so there's a bit of a discussion about this. Mondos, however, kind of steps in and says, yes, the elves will come in this age, but not quite yet, and it's fated that they will first see the stars, and to Varda will they ever call at need. So after all of this discussion, Varda then takes thought and says, I'm going to do something a little bit new. Not entirely new. She had already made a bunch of stars, but they're faint and far away, and it tells us that after this Council of the Valar, she goes and takes the light that's been gathered in the vats from the dew or sap or whatever you want to call it from Telperion, the silver tree, and she takes this and she makes new and brighter stars. And it gives us a whole bunch of elven names for stars and constellations, the most significant for our purposes, and it doesn't tell us this in the text, but you can gather it from this and other texts, are the Menelmacar, which is basically Orion. It says that he has a shining belt. That's Orion. And the Valakirka, which is the sickle of the gods, which it tells us, I believe in a footnote in the Lord of the Rings, if I'm remembering correctly, that this is the Big Dipper. I mean, if you think about it, the Big Dipper looks like a cup, but you could also imagine it as a scythe. So it's the sickle of the gods, and the sickle of the gods in this particular case is kind of meant as an omen against Melkor, kind of reminding him, we still have the power here, Melkor. So as she finishes her labors, the elves awake at Cuiviénen, which it just calls the Waters of Awakening. And so the elves finally come on the scene. The text tells us that the Cuiviénen is basically near the base of where the original northern lamp had been at the great lake, inland lake, or sea of Helkar. Now, there's nothing about this on any of the maps, and in fact it tells us that this is in the far east of Middle-earth, and based on what we get later, it's pretty clear that this is further east than anything we ever see, even in the Third Age maps. So we don't really know where this is, and in fact it tells us in the text, to Cuiviénen there is no returning. The shape of the earth has been changed since then, and so there's really no knowing where Cuiviénen was. At any rate, the elves awake, and sure enough, the first thing they see is the stars. And I forgot to mention also, Mondos, in connection with that, said that great light shall be for their waning, which becomes significant later, especially much later. So anyway, they first hear the stars, and the other thing that, they first see the stars, and the first thing that they hear is the sound of falling water. They're near a mountain, there's rivers coming down out of the mountains, so they start out with hearing moving water, and they start out seeing the stars. Now they start to, speak and, name things, and one of the things that they name, of course, is themselves. They name themselves the Quindi, which basically just means the speakers, which makes sense. They're the only things that they know of that can speak. So they have language. All the things that they see around them apparently don't. As they're kind of growing up by themselves, Orome, of course, is still doing his thing, riding out into Middle-earth every now and then. And one day he's riding out, and his horse, Nahar, suddenly neighs and just stops still, and he hears the singing of the Quindi. And so he goes and takes a look, and sure enough, there's the elves, and he's like, whoa, here they are. And it tells us that thus the elves were discovered, as it were, by chance. So probably not chance, but seemingly chance. And Orome then goes to, kind of meet them, but they all kind of flee from him. And it tells us that there's a little bit of a backstory here of a dark rider that would come and take away elves who were kind of wandering alone or in few company. And it tells us that the wise later kind of determined this was probably Melkor not only doing his own nefarious things, but doing it in a way that would make them fear Orome, because he knew that Orome still rode through Middle-earth, and so he wanted to make whatever it was that made the elves afraid as much like Orome as possible, so as to make them not want to, interact with Orome. And we also, of course, get a little bit of information about what might have happened to these other elves, and it again tells us that the best guess of the wise is that they were taken to Melkor's dungeons and corrupted over time and made into the orcs. So there's your origin of orcs, and it tells us that Melkor, because of his fall and whatnot, couldn't make things of his own. He could really only debase or corrupt what's already there. So anyway, that's all that. However, the elves, see Orome, and they realize he's not dark like this other thing that they've been encountering, and he has the light of Valinor in his face. And so some of the elves kind of step forward and actually interact with him. And then things really start to kick off. Orome returns to Valinor and has the Valar hold council to decide what they're going to do. Manwë kind of, again, takes thought with himself and with Iluvatar, seemingly, and basically says it's time that we, reassert ourselves and retake the mastery of Middle-earth, so as to not leave these children of Iluvatar in shadow and, under the subjection of Melkor. And so they send Orome back to, and with others as well, to kind of watch after the elves while they go and make war against Melkor in the north. So it tells us that at first the Valar have a pretty swift victory. The servants of Melkor retreat before them, but then they hide out in Utumno, and the siege becomes very long, drawn out. One of the results of this war is that the shape of Middle-earth again is changed, and it tells us that the Great Sea, Beligire, becomes wider. The continent of Aman, where Valinor is, and Middle-earth get farther apart as a result, and there's also a lot of bays created and mountains raised. And the most significant thing is it tells us the Bay of Valar, which is kind of the southernmost bay in Middle-earth at this point, is created during this time. If you've got a map of Middle-earth, you can look at that. It's not hugely important for the story, but it gives you an idea of how much wreckage goes on as a result of this war. The elves, who are way far to the east, get some rumor of it. They feel the earth shaking. They can see kind of fire up in the northern part of Middle-earth. So it's not clear how far away they are. We know they're really far away, but they can still get some indication of what's going on. So they're justifiably a little bit afraid of these great powers doing all their really dangerous things. At any rate, eventually the gates of Utumno are broken down. The Valar unroof it. They go in, kind of break everything up, and Tulkas, fights Melkor one-on-one, throws him on his face, and it tells us that he binds him with a chain that Aule had made called Angainor. I think this chain gets used again later, but that's a story for another time. And they take Melkor back to Valinor for judgment, basically. He begs for pardon. Manwë basically says, no, you're not getting off that easy. And he is sentenced to spend 3 ages in the halls of Mondos. What 3 ages means exactly, it's not clear, but at any rate, he's sentenced to 3 ages in Mondos, at which time he can kind of reassert his case and sue for pardon again. So that's kind of what happens, and it tells us that Melkor never forgot that it was because of the Elves that this war was waged on him, and as a result, he hates the Elves. So that's the war that the Valar make. Now we have to figure out what happens with the Elves themselves. I did forget to mention at the end of this war, it does say that the Valar didn't find all of the hidden halls of Utumno because they were hidden very deceptively. And it also says that Angband was mostly kind of left alone, and Sauron they didn't find. So, premonition of things to come. But meanwhile, the Valar have to decide what to do with the Elves. And Ulmo and some of the others are all for leaving the Elves in Middle-earth, rather, and with the idea that they can heal some of the hurts that Melkor has caused with their gifts. And that seems like a pretty good idea, but most of the Valar are kind of afraid for the Elves because Middle-earth is still dark. There are still evil things in Middle-earth. Moreover, they want very much to be in company with the Elves because these are, the beings that they've been looking forward to for a long time. They want to actually have a friendship with them. And so most of the Valar lean that way, and so it's decided finally that they will bring the Elves to Valinor, and Mondos just kind of ends with an ominous note, so it is doomed. Now, doomed in this sense doesn't mean doom and gloom, it just means fated or decided. So that's not necessarily a bad thing, but the fact that Mondos just kind of steps in at the very end and says, so it is doomed, it kind of has a eerie sense about it. So, and it does tell us in the text as well that a lot of bad things do follow from bringing the Elves to Valinor, which we will of course get to in the next several chapters. For now, however, they send Orome back to the Elves, and Orome, who had named them the Eldar, or Star People in their own tongue, basically tells them this is what the plan is, but the Elves are a little bit hesitant. They're like, well, we don't really know about these trees and Valinor and things that you're telling us about, and we kind of like it here. So what they decide to do is take 3 ambassadors who will go to Valinor to get an idea of, is this worth the trip? And these 3 ambassadors will end up becoming the kings of the 3 kindreds of the Elves. You have Ingwe, who is the leader of the Vanyar, the High Elves or Fair Elves. You have Finwë, who is the leader of the Noldor, the Deep Elves. And you have Elwë, who is will be one of the 2 leaders of the Teleri, the Sea Elves, or there's various different names for the Teleri, the Terriers. They tarry, they're slow. We'll get to that in a minute. His brother is Olwë. He becomes the other leader of this group of Elves. So anyway, Elwë, Finwë, and Ingwe, they go to Valinor, and they see the 2 trees, and they are enamored of it, and they're like, yes, we definitely want to go to Valinor. So they return, talk most of the Elves into returning with them, but some of the Elves are still, we don't really want to go. That's still kind of like, this is hearsay. We don't really know what we're getting into. We kind of like it here. So not all of the Elves decide to go. The Elves that don't decide to go are called the Avari, the unwilling. You probably won't ever need to know that, but in case you do, there's your name. The Eldar, which is the name Orome gave to the Elves kind of as a group, become just those Elves who actually set out on the westward journey. So even though we tend to think of Eldar as meaning all Elves, it actually doesn't. So there's another interesting piece of trivia for you. So they set out. The first group to leave, and the most into it, are the Vanyar, led by Ingwe, and it tells us that these are beloved by Manwë and Barda. They're they're always kind of the most Valinor focused of all the elves. And the second group, which is larger, is the Noldor, led by Finwë, and it tells us that they become the friends of Aule. That's the Noldor is a name of wisdom. They're the deep elves because they are, deep meaning kind of deep in what they study, what they do. These are, very much attuned to Aule. They make things, that sort of thing. And then the last, and by far the largest group, is the Teleri, and they're called the Teleri because they tarry on the road. And we see this over the course of their journey toward Valinor. They take a lot more time than the other elves. They're a lot more, but they like Middle-earth more, and they're less interested in getting to Valinor, let's say. But they set out, finally, and they cross a lot of terrain, and it tells us the overall journey takes years. Ingwe and his people are always kind of in the lead, followed by Finwë, and then followed by Elwë and Olwë. So we get to a major point where they cross through a big forest, and then they get to a large river, and it says later it was kind of determined that this was Anduin the Great. So we're talking about the big river in the Middle-earth that we know from the Third Age that flows through Osgiliath and between the Misty Mountains and Mirkwood or Greenwood. And so presumably the forest they came through probably was Greenwood itself. And it tells us that along this journey, sometimes Orome would leave and go back to Valinor and then come back to help lead them along. During the periods where Orome left, the elves, not really knowing where they were going or anything, would just kind of sit there, wait for him to return. And this is one of those spots. I mean, finally the Vanyar and the Noldor cross over the Hithaglir, the Misty Mountains, but the Teleri here really kind of slow down their trip because they're like, man, those are some big mountains. And in fact, a group of the Teleri at this point break off under the leadership of an elf named Linwë. And he leads them south to other parts of Middle-earth, and they don't really come back into the story until later when, under the leadership of his son Denethor, they actually finally cross into Beleriand. And it tells us that these become known as the Nondor. And they'll come back into the story later, so I won't spoil all that for right now, but they eventually do, or at least some of them eventually do, come into Beleriand. But for now, they're separated off to a completely, they kind of do their own thing. Ingwe and Finwë lead their following finally over the Ered Luin, the Blue Mountains, into Beleriand. The Teleri are still kind of hanging out on the other side of the Misty Mountains, and it tells us that Elwë was great friends with Finwë, so he's kind of like not too happy about that. But Finwë and Ingwe with the Noldor and Vanyar finally come to the Great Sea, and it's huge, and they don't really know what to think about it, and so they're kind of like, I'm not so sure about this. And for the time being, they kind of just back away from it and live in the forests of Beleriand. So, and it tells us while they're waiting there, finally Elwë and Olwë and the Teleri manage to make it their way into Beleriand because Elwë wants to catch up with Finwë, being great friends with him. And it tells us that they kind of end up crossing the Blue Mountains, and they kind of just stop just to the west of the mountains. They don't make it all the way to the west because, again, they're moving slower than the rest of the elves. So that's kind of where this part of the story ends, with the elves just kind of waiting around in Beleriand. Orome, meanwhile, goes back to Valinor, to talk with the Valar about, okay, now what do? We still got to get these guys to Valinor itself. So that's where the story leaves us. So now we finally have the coming of the Elves, the firstborn children of Iluvatar, and the captivity of Melkor for 3 long ages, whatever exactly that means. Hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, please do give it a thumbs up and share it around. I will, of course, as I mentioned earlier, link to the playlist for the Silmarillion Synopsis so you can catch up on any videos you missed and pay attention for future videos that come out. The next chapter, we will start getting the elves moved to Valinor, and things will really start to pick up. We'll start having the action really move towards a lot of the major conflicts of the story. So do pay attention if you're interested in following along. If you want to follow the channel generally, you can follow me on Twitter at JRRTLore. You can support the channel at my Patreon page below, and of course you can subscribe here and find a couple of my previous videos here. Until the next time, I'm the Tolkien Geek signing out for the Tolkien Lore channel. Namaste.